before I begin? How long before you decide? But before I know what it feels like. Okay, howdy, Ags. Welcome to another episode of Exercise Biomechanics. Today we've got a short one. I just want to finish up the first part of the class and preparation for exam number 1 by focusing on moment of inertia. And I've got a couple new slides and trying to clarify a few things. And this will actually, again, end material for class or for test number 1, our comprehensive exam. So again, the topic today is moment of inertia. What's moment of inertia? Well, Newton's first law of motion is the law of inertia. And inertia is resistance to motion, to a change in motion. So that resistance has to be overcome by a force for linear motion. But for angular motion, we have to use torque to overcome that inertia. And the specific term we have for that is moment of inertia. So moment really means torque or bending force in physics language, or over in Britain, they often call torque moment. So moment of inertia actually doesn't have anything to do with time. It's all about inertia, resistance to angular motion, etc. So moment of inertia really means torque of inertia or rotation of inertia, or inertia related to rotation. Probably best to say it that way. So it's kind of a weird term. The moment of inertia takes into account not just the mass. So remember, for linear motion, the inertia basically can mathematically be encompassed or by focusing on the mass. So here we're going to be focusing not only the mass, but the distribution of the mass. So for a rod, it's a constant that depends upon the shape times the mass times something called the radius of gyration. And the radius of gyration is roughly the distance between the axis of rotation and the center of mass. Technically, it's the sum of the masses and their individual radii of gyration. So if you are into calculus and computer programming, that's actually how you would do it. So our formula is just going to be an approximation. In addition, there are some shapes like hollow tubes, like you actually might see in a bone like the femur or the tibia, long bone like that, where the moment of inertia is proportional to the fourth power of the radius. So the point is that as the radius of gyration increases, you get a dramatically increased moment of inertia or resistance against turning or torque. So sometimes that's going to be something we have to overcome. Sometimes, though, it's actually a good thing in terms of protection against bones. And as we're going to see, we can use it in our favor either way, believe it or not, when we're thinking about the design of new tennis rackets. So tennis rackets today. So there's a, see, I have to back up a little bit. This is a steel racket. This was high tech in like 1978, 79, something like that. Before that was a wooden racket. Wooden rackets were really heavy. The steel rackets weren't much lighter, but you can see the size of the head is a lot smaller. And that's going to have everything to do with being able to maximize the sweet spot and to be able to control a shot when we hit it. So much different design. This steel racket is actually considerably heavier than this. Is a titanium kind of composite, which has some graphite in it. So that combination seems to be the best today. Titanium's a really cool metal. You see it in artificial knees and limbs. Sometimes it's really stiff. It's light, but it's incredibly strong. And it's resistant to lots of banging. So important for prosthetics as well as sports equipment. So you also see it in the heads of drivers and metal woods these days. Okay, so again, this is kind of a basic formula. There's some cases, again, with like a hollow tube where the moment of inertia is proportional to the fourth power of the radius. So just to remember where we're getting these formulas and what they're having to do with anything. in terms of motion. So this is very simple. You saw this in high school, and of course again in college. Force is equal to mass times acceleration. That's actually from Newton's second law. We're not trying to get too far ahead of ourselves, but what we want to do is be able to look at the angular analog or equivalent of this very famous equation. So here the mass is the inertia. It's the resistance to motion. So if we produce a force, we can overcome that inertia and accelerate that object. So if we hit a baseball, for example, and we're increasing the linear acceleration of the ball, hopefully making it go out. So we have to change its speed. So today we got a lot of pitchers throwing it in the major leagues about 100 miles an hour, a lot more than there used to be. So if you can make good contact with the ball, if you hit it about 110 miles an hour in the opposite direction and get enough loft on it, it's probably going to be a home run, or is a chance at a home run. So that's kind of the magic speed, 105, 110. If you get the 115, it's launched. So the angular equivalent to the mass here is the moment of inertia, which is a combination of the mass and the radius of gyration to some power squared, fourth power, etc. So torque is the angular equivalent of force, moment of inertia is the angular equivalent of mass, and then of course angular acceleration is the angular equivalent of linear acceleration. Looking at the equations this way and thinking about the linear equation and then the angular equivalent is really important for you to understand how these things work and to be able to use these equations. A lot of times people have trouble with math and physics because they don't use it or think about it. So it's like any kind of language. The more you use it and the more you apply it, the better understanding you'll have of that language and actually what to do with it. And this is a really important language because it's the language of the universe. It's the language of the universe we live in, especially between the subatomic and the galactic levels. So we can actually predict all kinds of things. So in a world where there's a lot of fake news and Facebook is telling people all kinds of crazy stuff regarding vaccines, etc., that you shouldn't be paying attention to. Same thing is true with Twitter for the most part. You got to watch out and really be careful about the information. Try to get good sources, reliable sources, as they say. Okay, so here's an example. I'm thinking about when I was a kid, or at least younger, playing softball, and then I think after college, I was in a softball league for a while, and I had this bat called a bomb bat, and I figured I would hit lots of home runs with it. It was made of steel. It was really heavy, and and I had been wrestling and working out, so I felt like I was a little stronger. I could just take this big, massive bat and hit it a long way. But what I hadn't counted on, I should have, because I'd had lots of physics as an engineering student back in the day, but I hadn't applied and thought about it. The problem with the bomb bat was twofold. The balance point is basically the center of mass. The axis of rotation is here, let's say right kind of in the middle or near the end of the handle where we're going to grab it with our hand. So in between the two hands, that's where basically the axis of rotation is going to be. We use something called a force couple to be able to do that. We'll talk more about that later. So the distance between this balance point and the axis of rotation is roughly the radius of gyration. So it had two problems with the bomb bat. The bomb bat was really heavy, had a lot of mass. The second problem was the radius of gyration was higher. So that meant that that moment of inertia was incredibly high. And when I want to accelerate the bat into the hitting zone, that caused a problem because math. Okay, this is why math is important, because you can use it, you can predict accurately what's going to happen. So we can predict with great accuracy that if I can produce a certain amount of torque, in other words, I worked out as hard as I can, I've worked on my technique, I can maximize the amount of torque getting the bat into the hitting zone. But if the moment of inertia is higher, then, if then, that's what science is made out of, a lot of if then statements, straight logic. If the moment of inertia is very high, then for a given torque that doesn't change, then the angular acceleration must decrease. Okay, so these two are inversely proportional to each other for a constant torque. Does that make sense? So really focusing on direct relationships and inverse relationships with these very straightforward formulas is incredibly important because they become predictive of cause and effect. That's the secret. Shouldn't be a secret, but that's the secret for real news versus fake news. What's the cause? What's the effect? Not what's the BS that's floating around, whatever your favorite social media happens to be. Okay, so again, let's say though, if we can reduce that moment of inertia by reducing the mass and or reducing the radius of gyration, then for a given torque, the angular acceleration has to increase, right? Okay, well, we actually started to see this in baseball, etc. So here's a reminder, way back in the day, talk about doing things wrong. So the bomb bat was a complete failure. I didn't hit any home runs with the bomb bat. Bomb bat was a bust. So I went to something lighter. I think I found an aluminum bat eventually and just tried to hit a lot of singles and doubles after that. So if I'd known, I would have choked up. I would have done some things. Okay, maybe worked out even more. So we're going to show you the consequence of that in just a minute. Okay, I've got to move stuff around. Hold on. There we go. And then, okay, sorry about that adjustment. Okay, so when I was a kid, maybe they did this for you. They had these weight donuts they would put on the bats, right? For um, sometimes we'd see it in softball, but most of the time, like Little League, other types of youth softball and baseball. So the whole idea is you'd swing on these things, you'd warm up, you'd be ready to go. And if you swung the bat and the bat was heavy, then when you took the weight donut off the ball, the bat would feel light and you'd be able to swing faster. So that was the thing. If you want to get stronger, with a bat, do weightlifting, especially, with your core and shoulders, etc. Bench press as well and lots of shoulder exercises to be able to get stronger in hitting the ball and producing more torque. The more force you can produce, therefore the more torque you'll be able to produce. If you can produce more torque, there we go. If you can produce more torque and you can either maintain the moment of inertia or decrease it, I'm going to show you how in a moment, then you're definitely going to have a big increase in angular acceleration. Okay, so the weight donut, was that a good idea? Well, the good news is you didn't have it on while you were trying to hit the baseball or a softball. The weight donut, well, let's look at these two bats so we can see the difference in the moment of inertia. Let's say the mass is exactly the same. The mass of the weight donut is the same. The mass of the bats is the same. So this part doesn't change. That's a constant based on the shape of the bat. If we reduce the distance between the axis of rotation and center of mass of the weight donut, that means we reduce the moment of inertia. Okay, so that's cool. But when you put a weight donut on, and I remember a lot of times we would try to basically bang the bat to get the weight donut as far down as possible, which would increase the radius of gyration, which we had no idea what it meant at the time. But it means, in terms of biomechanics, that the moment of inertia is increased. So what did the research say? Did it work? No. It does the opposite. It makes you swing slower. You're actually better off warming up with a wiffle bat just to get used to swinging a little bit faster. And why is faster good? Because in the end, whether it's golf or tennis or baseball or softball, it's all about racket speed, club head speed in golf, bat speed. That's what does it. That's what gets you into the zone. You need to have, bit of strength to be able to impart that momentum into the ball when it strikes. That's part of the conservation of linear momentum, which we'll get to pretty shortly next time. So back in the day, this is back in the day. This is the Pittsburgh Pirates of the 1970s. Big guys really feared, Willie Stargell, all of those guys. They call themselves the lumber company because they would take out the heavy lumber. They had the dreaded 46-ounce bat. It was massive. It was huge. However, the moment of inertia, because the mass is high, and they hadn't learned how to kind of shave these things down right. Sometimes the radius of gyration was higher too, and they often held the bat right up against the end of the handle. Here's Barry Bonds. Now, he had a bit of help, allegedly, growth hormone or whatever. He didn't do that till age 37 and would have hit probably close to 755 home runs, if not more, and breaking the record without the asterisks. Um, but he did. He decided that um, other folks were hitting lots and lots of home runs. So Mark McGwire was hitting like 70 home runs over a couple of seasons. Sammy Sosa right around the same thing. And so he decided to get into the action. However, there were some really important things that he did and that baseball players did is he somehow figured out, and maybe he looked at the formula, maybe someone else looked at the formula, maybe they just figured it out, that if you use a lighter bat and you choke up on the bat and you get right next to home plate, and you don't mind getting hit by a ball every once in a while, then you can put yourself in a position to hit a lot of home runs. He also had a really compact swing, a really good kinematic chain where he would rotate his trunk, his most central axis, and get the arms into the hitting zone really quickly, as you can see right here. So with the bat, he choked up on the bat. What does that do? That reduces the radius of gyration. And he used a 31.6-ounce bat instead of a 46-ounce bat. Greatly reduced the mass. Therefore, the moment of inertia was dramatically reduced. And because he did a lot of weightlifting and possibly some other stuff, he would have been able to really maximize his torque. Big torque, reduce the moment of inertia, you get big angular acceleration of the bat into the hitting zone. That's exactly what happened. So he hit a lot of home runs. He still hit a lot of home runs before he was allegedly juiced. Of course, if you probably have read about that era, um, the pitchers were juiced also. The pitchers seem pretty juicy today. They're able to throw the ball. A lot of them are able to throw the ball close to 100 miles an hour. They only usually pitch a few innings. You probably notice in a baseball game, they often have lots of pitchers. I think the Chicago Cubs this season, and they had a June swoon that was, I don't know, it's hardly been seen before. I think they're 4-15 in 4-15 in the last month. Actually, you shouldn't say June. 4-15 in the last month. Pretty bad. But before that, they had a no-hitter, I think, against the Dodgers of all teams, who were the World Series champs last year. But I think it took 5 pitchers to throw that no-hitter. Really weird. So yeah, things are weird today. And also, because of the advanced metrics, and a lot of GMs and a lot of managers now are using advanced metrics, whereas before the Boston Celtics, Boston Red Sox, excuse me, Boston Red Sox won the World Series a few times, and they had gone to advanced metrics, and the Oakland A's had gone to metrics first. The thought, was, well, get on base, bunt, all of that kind of stuff, advance the runners. But the advanced metrics actually say for certain players that can hit 20 or more home runs a season, that you're better off trying to hit a home run or a double or a triple and strike out more often. So that's actually what we're seeing today. Pitchers are throwing faster. People are swinging for the fences. So there are more home runs and more strikeouts today. So some of the purists are grumbling, but that's the way it goes. They are using the same type of equipment. The bats are a little bit different because ash trees got a parasite about 15 years ago. And so they've gone to, I think, maple trees. The only bad thing about that, if a maple um, wood bat breaks, it's more likely to splinter and pieces of it fly into the stand. So the netting has gotten bigger. If you're wondering why, it's actually because of the change in bats. The bats hit it farther. Well, I don't really know. Um, so some examples of moment of inertia. We got the Summer Olympics maybe coming up. I don't know. COVID. Who knows who'll be left? Maybe there'll just be three people in each event left, and we can just give them the gold and silver and bronze medal, and they can do some type of demonstration. Then we'll move on. Okay, so this is Winter Olympic stuff. We're talking, of course, about women's figure skating. If you have your arms and a leg out, then if the axis of rotation is down someone's middle and they're spinning, then they have actually a high moment of inertia, because you can have the moment of inertia in 2 or even 3 dimensions, not just 1 dimension. So this is Oksana Bayul. This is from the 90s. I've got a few pictures from the 90s. Unfortunately, didn't have HD TV, and so a lot of these are basically screenshots from VHS tapes and that type of stuff. So this is Oksana Bayul, 1994 Olympic Games. Why the heck am I showing you this? Because this is, I think, a triple Lutz and the first triple ever to be done in, I think, Olympic competition. And part of the reason I'm showing you this is that she's got her arms in, her legs wrapped around each other. So she had very low mass. She weighed about 89 pounds soaking wet. And then wrapping that mass, what little there was, around her body, that gives her a really small moment of inertia. So given torque she's producing as she's pushing off the ice and causing that spin, that's one of the things that allows her to do that, to do those triples back in the day. And she won the 1994 Olympic gold medal. Divers, when they go from the pike position to the tuck position, are doing the same thing. They're reducing the moment of inertia by bringing the mass closer to the axis of rotation, which can increase the spin rate. Okay, another example, the spin technique in the shot put is actually based upon the discus. So it's 1.5 turns, 540 degrees. But the shot put has a lot more mass than the discus. The discus, I think, is 2.2 kilograms, and the shot put's close to 8 kilograms. So they take that shot put, instead of putting it outstretched in their arm, where they would probably break their shoulder and or elbow and go to the hospital, they're going to put it right next to their neck, and sometimes they press it up against their neck. So by flexing the elbow, getting that shot put close to the neck, that actually reduces the moment of inertia by reducing the radius of gyration. You're not changing the mass. So this is actually a really good picture, because this angle compared with horizontal is the ideal launch angle. It's about 37 degrees for the shot put. It also allows, one of the things you're noticing is that, look how these arms are lined up. So by tilting over like that, that means that that lead arm is going to go through horizontal adduction around the shoulder. And you can produce a lot of muscle mass because you have the anterior deltoid, the upper pecs, or the clavicular head of the pectoralis major, and the sternal head of the pectoralis major. All of those muscles are going to be involved in that throw. Here's actually Randy Barnes, Aggie, who won the Olympic gold in 1996. Is from the 90s. That's what the picture looks like this. He also set the world record in the shot put in 1990 and lasted until actually just this year. So it was 31 years, one of the longest held records in track and field. So this Randy Barnes, one of your gold medal winners in the shot put. The other one is Randy Manson, who I think won multiple gold medals. Okay, so the next application is the moment of inertia and the sweet spot. What the heck's the sweet spot? Well, the sweet spot is usually relative to an axis of rotation, and or specific to an axis of rotation, and it has to do relative to the axis of rotation. So if we hit an off-center shot with a tennis racket, it's going to try to make it turn across the long axis. If you're hitting a forehand shot so that your body is perpendicular with the line of the shot itself. Then the axis of rotation around the long end of the tennis racket is going to be, we'll call that the z-axis, because this would be the z-axis here, right? Perpendicular to the frontal plane. So we got a frontal plane motion. So this would be the z-axis. And compared with a wooden racket, you can see our modern racket, which again is usually a composite of titanium and graphite. It has a mass that's distributed farther away from that axis of rotation. So you can have mass distribution in 2 dimensions and even 3 dimensions. A golf club's kind of the same way. Golf clubs, whether they're irons or the quote unquote metal woods, they have a much bigger head, larger sweet spot. There's the center of mass. Anything in here is the sweet spot. What does that mean? Well, if you hit it, it's not going to go off center, or it's not going to go to the left or right as much. You won't have and whether it's tennis or golf, you're going to have a relatively straight shot. So the sweet spot is critical. So how do we maximize that sweet spot? So again, we increase the size of either the tennis racket head or the size of the golf club head. We use light materials that will help. A wooden tennis racket is a lot heavier than today's racket. Even the steel racket I have from back in the day is a lot heavier than this racket. Also, if you look at where the center of mass is, it's of the racket in, let's say, this direction, it's actually going to be a little farther from the handle in the steel racket than it would today's racket. So that's another interesting thing, and we'll get to that in a moment, because that moment of inertia is going to be specific to the axis of rotation. So when we're trying to prevent an off-center shot from turning or torquing our tennis racket, then that's going to be, we'll call that the z-axis. So that's what we see here. This is the z-axis. So the bigger the head, the greater the resistance to angular movement or rotation, moment of inertia. We actually want a high moment of inertia in this case. The wooden tennis racket, even though it's actually heavy, but if we look at the mass around the head, even though it's a little higher, it's distributed much closer. So let's just pretend it's twice the mass. But the radius of gyration is, let's say, 1/2, okay? That means that, because that's to the second power, that means we're going to have, in the end, twice the moment of inertia for this wooden racket, or I'm sorry, half of the moment of inertia for this wooden racket as we will for the today's racket along this axis, okay, along this z-axis. Even though it's heavier, the radius of gyration is smaller, and since that's related to the second power, you're actually going to have a lower moment of inertia. And that means the sweet spot is smaller. Another thing about wooden rackets is they didn't have a coefficient of elasticity or bounce or springiness that's nearly as high as today's racket. So the ball wouldn't bounce off it quite as well. And the wooden rackets, even the steel rackets, tended to vibrate, which causes interference with the sweet spot. So this combination in today's racket, high moment of inertia, high coefficient of elasticity or bounce, springiness, if you will, and reduced vibration maximizes that sweet spot, allows us to be able to hit it straight, hit it hard with a high velocity. So the reason I wanted to point out these different axes is that when you're swinging a racket, and let's say you're hitting a forehand shot, your body's rotating around a y-axis. So why is that important? Well, when you look at the tennis racket around the y-axis in your arm, what's happening is, if you have a tennis racket today that has a low mass, and actually the balance point or center of mass is actually closer to the handle, we actually have a situation much like Barry Bonds figured out with a baseball bat, for the y-axis, we have actually a low mass and a significantly or a reduced moment of inertia. So that means a much, much larger or much smaller moment of inertia. And then the point I'm getting to, because I'm thinking ahead of myself, I'm like, oh, I'm going to throw in another formula down here.